Altair, Apple floppy days, Commodore, Tandy floppy days, Atari, TI floppy days. The weekend comes, the disk drive hums, ready to code for you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we played, you shared with me. Those days, Motorola, Intel 6502, graphics and text are there to view. Composite, color, or RGB, program fun for you and me.
Floppy Days is recorded in a live studio.
Inside PC floppy days, ST Amiga floppy days, Junior Sinclair floppy days, classic days, microwaves, geeking all week with you. These days we're all happy and free. Those floppy days, the games we play, you shared with me. Those days, these floppy days are yours and mine. These floppy days are yours and mine. Floppy days.
The TRS-80 Model 3.
Introducing the Apple IIc.
Atari 1040 ST.
Commodore 64. What?
PC Junior, new from IBM.
Discover Atari. It's at his Radio Shack Color Computer 3. Introducing the Timex Sinclair 1000.
For computer, this is the one. Texas Instruments home computer.
A wonder computer of the 1980s. The Commodore VIC-20.
Hello, and welcome to episode 149 of the Floppy Days podcast for March 2025, where computers of the late 70s through the 80s and the slogan, "Have you played Atari today?" are our favorite things. In this episode, we will be continuing coverage of an amazing piece of hardware, the HP97 and 67 Programmable Calculator. I speak of them as one because, as we cover in great detail, they are internally the same machine, with the main difference being the built-in printer for the HP97. This is part 2 of what is a 3-part series on the HP97/67. I was very fortunate to get a fantastic co-host for this episode, HP calculator historian Wlodek Mier-Jedrzejowicz. Wlodek has a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience with the HP calculators, and I think you'll find his stories and background extremely interesting and helpful as we go through the history of the HP97. In this episode, we'll be beginning with the technical specs for the HP97, then working our way through using the machine, user groups, and magazines and newsletters. Our final HP97 episode will come very soon and will cover topics like books, modern upgrades, current websites, and a whole lot more, as is typically covered on Floppy Days. I should reiterate, as mentioned in the last episode, that the HP97 episodes do veer from the timeline a bit. Whereas I've been covering the machines that were introduced in 1982, with the last being the Grundy New Brain, the HP97 and 67 were introduced in 1976. By rights, these machines should have been covered in a very early episode, just after the MIT's Altair 8800 and the same general time frame as the Apple I. However, I felt it was important to go back and pick up this machine, so I hope you will forgive me for departing from the timeline order a little bit for this. Before we go on, let's not forget to mention some of the great storefronts that support our vintage computing hobby. For instance, 8bitclassics.com, run by my friend Corey Colts, is a great place to get vintage computer items. He has video cables, he has power supplies, he has upgrades and more for a wide variety of vintage computer platforms. I often talk about items that I have gotten from 8-Bit Classics. Corey's been a friend of the show for quite some time, and I really appreciate his support of the podcast. Check out his site. Another one is arcadeshopper.com, run by my friend Greg McGill, who's very active in the vintage computer community, and he has a terrific site to get vintage computer items. He has really a lot of hard-to-find items for a large number of platforms. This is another site I do and have done a lot of shopping at, and I've mentioned numerous times on Floppy Days. If anything shows out of stock, just ping Greg through the contact form, and he can check whether he has or can get more of the item for you. FutureVision Research, a more recent vendor managed by my friend Brian Cox. If you're in need of a FujiNet for any of the official platforms, the Apple II, the Atari 8-bit, the Coco, or the Coleco Atom, Brian has what you need. He also has some cool soldering kits for whatever skill level you're at, including beginner. Just recently, Brian was kind enough to send me the cool beginner's soldering kit he and the Vent Nerd created specifically for VCF SoCal 2025, which happened in February earlier this year. And I'm looking forward to putting that together. Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate it. For all of these storefronts, when you place an order, please mention Floppy Days in the notes or comments of the order, and that will help support the podcast. Many thanks. I also want to mention those listeners who appreciate the show enough to donate through patreon.com. I really appreciate you guys, and it helps offset the cost of running the podcast. A new supporter I wanted to mention is Call Apple User Group. I have recently been providing content through Floppy Days for their monthly magazine, and am very pleased and appreciative of their support of the podcast. I have found ways to reward those who are generous enough to monetarily support the Floppy Days podcast on Patreon, which is at patreon.com/floppydays, such as early access to videos of interviews like the one being brought to you in audio form this episode. Visit Patreon to see more details concerning the rewards for supporters. I always will make all content available to everyone at no cost, and yet I do have some benefits for those generous enough to support the podcast. Let me know your thoughts and enjoy.
Hi, this is Wlodek Mier-Jedrzejowicz. I've been an HP calculator fan since the first HP handheld calculator, which I used at my physics with mathematics undergrad course at Imperial College in London. And I've been using more and more HP calculators ever since. They are now available on emulators on your smartphone. But it's still worth using a real one. I've written books about them. We still run a club where people can meet either online or physically. It's been wonderful talking about these on Floppy Days, and I hope you come back to Floppy Days.
Okay, now for new acquisitions and what I've been up to. So I'm going to start off with some Atari 8-bit items that I've acquired recently and I haven't talked about on here yet. So recently I attended a local event with my son and his family at a country fairgrounds, and it was called Indie Geek Meet. Now, who could resist going to an event called that? It wasn't overly large, being confined to 2 fairly large rooms, but it was larger than many vintage computer events I've attended. There were a ton of items there of interest to geeks, as you might imagine from the name. As always, I was on the lookout for vintage computer items on the off chance there might be something there. I saw quite a bit of vintage gaming stuff. I saw some Atari 2600 stuff. I saw some Atari 5200 stuff, a PlayStation and some games for that, and really quite a bit of vintage gaming stuff. However, at one booth, sitting on a lower shelf in a small cardboard box, was an Atari 410 program recorder. Now, being a big Atari 8-bit fan, I couldn't resist buying this single vintage computer item I saw at the show. The device was very clean, and I got it for a really good price. Of course, I knew the chances were nearly 100% that it needed a new belt, as the old one likely had dissolved into goo, but I also knew the chances were very high that it would work once the belt was replaced. I already have a couple other 410s and the XL style 1010, but figured I could find a home for this. Now, also on the Atari 8-bit front, I want to talk about the 1027 printer. So that was my favorite Atari printer back in the day, and although it was slow, it produced nice typewriter quality output. I used it to print out homework and papers when I was working on my master's degree. While I typically do not acquire or keep printers in my collection, I just don't have the room, nor do I really have the inclination, I do have a soft spot for the 1027, and since they're pretty small, I've had an interest in getting one working for my 800 or XL or XE again. The problem with these printers today is that the printhead, which was made of some sort of rubber or plastic, has deteriorated to the point where they basically have fallen apart. Even if you find a new old stock 1027, the first time you turn it on, I guarantee you the printhead will disintegrate. A while back, someone with the handle Ergandor had recreated the printheads using a 3D printing process and had made a limited run available to the community. I purchased a single one at the time with the hopes I could get my 1027 going again. Unfortunately, the printers are very finicky, and if the printhead isn't installed perfectly, or if the printer head itself has any issues, it simply won't work. After I installed mine, it promptly broke, and I was left again with a non-functional printer. I really wished I had purchased more than a single printhead from the run. Recently, though, I had the opportunity to get a couple more printheads from ABIC, which is the Atari Bitbiters Users Club, great club. I jumped on the opportunity, and they were kind enough to send them to me from Germany. I haven't yet taken the time to attempt testing these printheads, taking more care to make sure everything's installed and working perfectly before trying it out this time, but I will do so soon. I really hope I can get the 1027 going. Next are some keyboard pads that I got. The Atari XE line of 8-bit computers are notorious for having what is typically called mushy keyboards. Both the 8-bit XE line and the Atari ST line, which essentially use the same keyboards, have this issue. Recently, someone on Facebook found that the domes inside the keyboard, which give the keyboard its feel, are the issue. You can buy replacement domes from places like Best Electronics. However, this person on Facebook found that the domes inside a very inexpensive keyboard available on Amazon worked very well for this. It's just a matter of taking apart the keyboard and cutting all the domes out, then putting those domes in the XE keyboard. I ordered a keyboard in order to do this, but haven't yet done all the tedious work of cutting out the domes. But I'll let you know how that goes. Another Atari item I got is a pilot book. The language pilot. Atari was kind of big into that, and they produced a book called the Atari 400-800 Student Pilot Reference Guide. Now I have the pilot cartridge, but I did not have this reference guide, and I found it on eBay and quickly ordered it. So that's it for Atari 8-bit items this month, but I do have some other items I want to talk about as well. For some reason, I've been on a kick lately to make some of my favorite computers portable, in the sense that they can be put into a case of some sort and run right out of the case without having to plug anything in. I think the thing that brought this to the forefront in my mind was realizing that the Atari XL XE line of computers can be run directly off a battery pack that has a USB connector with the right power supply cable. I also have a small LCD display with composite and RF inputs that can be run off of battery that can be used with it. I often take an Atari 8-bit to local vintage computer club meetings and to computer shows, so I thought this might be an easy way to make the machine portable and make a neat exhibit. I also discovered that some other machines, like the Coco, are able to be run off of battery. There's even a vendor, Portacoco, that I've been talking with that makes entire kits around turning a Tandy MC10 or Tandy Coco into portables. Tim Halloran makes an adapter that allows you to run much of your Coco right off of battery. To that end, when my wife and I peruse flea markets and antique shops, as we often do, I've been keeping an eye out for cases that might work for this. Recently, I came across a suitable suitcase of the right size at an antique shop that looked as though it might work. I also came across a metallic case at a flea market that was the perfect size. I purchased some pick and pluck foam for the suitcase to make perfect cutouts for the computer monitor and parts. At this point, I just need to put it all together and get a couple of these made, starting with the Atari 800XL and the Coco or MC10. More details to come as I get into it. Final thing I want to talk about has to do with the Lobo Max 80. In a previous episode, I talked about the Lobo Max 80, which is a TRS-80 Model 1 and Model 3 compatible that I acquired from the home of David and Teresa Welsh. At that time, I mentioned that the keyboard had issues, with about a dozen of the keys not working. It appears that something wet dripped down into the keyboard of the machine in storage, and which caused issues with it. They're Alps keys, identical to ones used in some other machines. I took the machine to an Indy Vintage Computer Club meeting, and a kind soul there desoldered the bad keys in exchange for a vintage item. I found that Ian Maverick of TRS-80 fame had enough of the keys at his store for me to fix this computer, so I ordered and received those. The whole time I've been working with this machine, as mentioned in the past, Tim Halloran has been providing input and guidance as he has a Max 80 and spent time a while back getting it all working. When I told him about the keyboard issue, he actually volunteered to solder in new key switches for me at no charge if I sent him the keyboard and new switches. I quickly took him up on his offer and sent everything off to him. Within a few days, he had the new switches soldered in and said everything was working great. He popped it back in the mail to me, and I just had to wait for it to get to me. It turns out it took almost 3 weeks to get back to me from Pittsburgh to Indianapolis because the lately unreliable USPS lost the package for a while, causing me to sweat. Anyway, I popped the keyboard back into the Max 80 case, and it now works great. I have nothing but immense appreciation for Tim Halloran for his incredible assistance in getting this Max 80 working. And that's it for new acquisitions this month.
Well, this was Roland Leurs from the south of the Netherlands, and I talked about the Acorn Atom at the Floppy Days podcast.
Okay, now let's talk about upcoming computer shows in 2025. Again, because we're just now getting into the vintage computer show season, there are quite a few here, and it seems like there's more every year, which is a good thing. Anyway, first up, in early April, April 4th through the 6th, you've got 2 shows that weekend. The Midwest Gaming Classic at the Baird Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and VCF East, also April 4th through the 6th in Wall, New Jersey. April 12th through the 13th is the Indie Classic Computer and Video Game Expo in Indianapolis, Indiana. April 26th through the 27th is the Commodore Los Angeles Super Show in Burbank, California. May 2nd through the 3rd is the 32nd annual Last Chicago Cocoa Fest in Carroll Stream, Illinois. May 3rd through the 4th, that same weekend, is VCF Europe in Munich, Germany. May 31st through June 1st is the Retrofest 2025 at the Steam Museum of the Great Western Railway in Swindon, UK. June 14th is the Vancouver Retro Gaming Expo in New Westminster, British Columbia, Canada. June 20th through the 22nd is VCF Southwest at the Davidson Gundy Alumni Center at the University of Texas, Dallas. June 20th through the 22nd, so that same weekend, is the Southern Fried Gaming Expo and VCF Southeast in Atlanta, Georgia. Also the same weekend, this time June 21st and 22nd, Pacific Commodore Expo Northwest at the Old Rainier Brewery Intraspace in Seattle, Washington. July 18 through 20 is Kansas Fest. It was originally announced that Kansas Fest was going to be a live event in Wichita, Kansas. However, it has been changed to now be a virtual-only event, and you can read about the reasoning for that at kansasfest.org. September 13th through the 14th is VCF Midwest, the big one. It's at the Schaumburg Convention Center in Schaumburg, Illinois. September 26th through the 28th is Tandy Assembly in Springfield, Ohio. October 17th through the 19th is the Portland Retro Gaming Expo in Portland, Oregon. October 25th is the Chicago TI International World Fair. So that's all I have, or that all I know about for 2025. You can find the full schedule published on the Floppy Days website. Just go there and you can see everything and get links to all of these shows. And that's it for upcoming shows in 2025.
I'm Neil Harris. I was a member of the VIC-20 launch team, affectionately known as the VIC Commandos, and you're listening to Floppy Days.
Okay, I had a couple of small pieces of feedback that I wanted to read to you guys. I really appreciate any time I get feedback, and I want to highlight this particular feedback that I got. First up was from Gene Wright, and he was commenting on the first part 1 episode that we did on the HP97. He said Texas Instruments did come out with the PC100 original printer base before the HP97 came out. It was for the SR52 Programmable, the precursor to the TI-58 and 59. That printer worked with the SR52 and the SR56, which is a 100-step key programmable. He said that was a very minor quibble. I just wanted to make sure you knew that TI was first here. Good job on the show. And thank you, Gene. I really appreciate your feedback. Gene has been a friend of the show for some time, and I'll be doing some future shows with Gene on other calculators. The second piece of feedback I wanted to highlight was from Carlos on Discord. He says, judging by the first of the HP series discussions, it's looking to shape up to be an excellent series. I really enjoyed the accounts from both of your contributors. The RAM check story is a good lesson on how to get the right results whilst handling the sensitivities of engineers. Happy 12th anniversary for the podcast, Randy. So thank you, Carlos. I really appreciate your feedback as well. And that's it for feedback this month. Okay, well, I'm pleased to announce that I do have a Meet the Listeners segment this month. Richard Goldstone was kind enough to send in a brief introduction of himself for the segment. So I really appreciate it, Richard. And everyone, meet Richard Goldstone.
Hello, this is Richard Goldstone from Auckland, New Zealand. My first computer was a ZX81 with a 16K RAM pack. I only had 2 games for it, Football Manager and Flight Simulator, but I spent a lot of time playing those and also typing in programs from magazines and books. After 2 years, I bought a VZ200, which is a rebadged laser 200 from VTech. It was a colour computer with sound, but I only had a black and white television, so the colour wasn't much use. There also wasn't many games or software for it available, maybe only 40 or 50. So again, I spent my time typing in programs from magazines. In 1986, I got an Amstrad CPC 664, which was a very good computer, all-in-one with a disk drive and colour monitor. I had that for a few years, collected many games for it, and magazines. Then I got an Amiga 500, which was a very good computer, amazing games, graphics, sound, all of that, but it just wasn't as much fun for me as the Amstrad, so I got rid of the Amiga and went back to an 8-bit Amstrad 6128, which I had for another few years, before moving on to an IBM PC, like everyone else did, I suppose, at the time. I started collecting vintage computers in the early 2000s, and at one time had dozens of different systems of all kinds from everywhere. I had 9 Amstrad CPCs and Commodores, VZ200s, Spectrums, an Einstein, a Mac, all sorts of things. But circumstances changed. I had to get rid of just about all my collection. All I have left now is a VZ200 and a complete collection of Amstrad computer user magazines, so I can read through them every now and then. These days I listen to lots of vintage computer podcasts and watch vintage computer shows on YouTube, and that's basically how I keep in touch with the vintage computer scene. I don't really do much else at the moment. Thank you, Randy, and goodbye.
Okay, and now we have the HP97. We'll be starting out talking about tech specs and various other topics with Wlodek Mier-Jedrzejowicz. Please enjoy.
Okay, let's jump into the tech specs a little bit on these machines. I always like to discuss things like what CPU they had and how much memory and keyboard and ports and things like that. Now, I couldn't find out much information as far as what CPU was inside these things. All I found was it said proprietary. It was proprietary HP CPU. Do you have any additional information that you know about the chip that was inside of these things?
Not really. If you look at articles that HP published in something called the HP Journal, which was a technical journal they published for years, actually they still do, in which they provide technical information about new products they make. HP were a member of a technology company. They made all sorts of medical devices and engineering devices, as well as calculators. When they introduced a new range of calculators, they would give a lot of technical information in it. And that technical information included information about their own proprietary CPUs, memory chips, and so on. And from that, you could quite clearly see that it was designed by someone in HP. It was not a chip made, wasn't a Z80 or whatever an 8088
Yeah.
or whatever. It was an HP specific CPU with memory chips specifically made for it. And HP at that time fabricated their own memory chips. And that's why many HP calculators were short of memory, because they weren't buying Japanese or TI chips. They were making them themselves, and it wasn't a big production run for them because they were making them for the calculators, so they couldn't scale up. So they were using their own technology, written up in their own in-house journal, which you could get, and which are available from a couple of guys who have very extensive HP archives on disk or nowadays on memory sticks. So you can get those, and that's where you'll find a technology description of each of these.
Okay.
Now, what we can say is that they had introduced a new technology after they'd made these original calculators, the 35, 45, and so on. They introduced a new technology for the Series 20 models, and they then upgraded that for the 67 and the 97. So I think it was a 10-bit CPU, and memory was 8-bit as opposed to 6-bit, so they could store more instructions and do a whole lot more stuff. It's still minimally very, very low power compared to these days. They had a stack of 4 registers, each of which had 10 digits. They had a last, and then they had 16 primary registers and 10 registers. They could swap with the lowest 10 of those. So that was 26 registers of memory plus the stack, 30 10-bit data storage registers, plus 250 something instructions, program instructions. If you ran out of those, you could write a program which said, now read in the next set of instructions for my program. And you could write programs that were very long and were stored on the memory cards. And every time you ran out of memory, you said, now read the next bit of the program in from another card.
Which is very interesting. I read that about it, and it's like, wow, I've never heard of that before. So it would completely replace the memory with whatever came in.
It would replace the program memory with the new instruction, and then at the end, you would have an instruction which said, read the first card again.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. That's pretty cool, though, I have to say.
I think they did that on some early mainframes where you had a program, and when you ran out of memory space, you read the next set of instructions off a tape.
Okay.
But this was on a handheld desktop machine.
As far as keyboard goes, you mentioned that the 97 had more keys.
Yes.
So on the 67, you've got as many as 4 functions on some of the keys.
Yeah.
By using gold, blue, and black labels.
Indeed, yes.
F, G, and H, I guess, right?
Yes, it did.
On
the 97, it was enough to have one yellow shift key.
Yep.
It had these 30 keys and these 25, 55 keys. That was more or less enough.
Somehow I came up with 56, so I counted them on my
You're probably correct. I probably miscounted one.
Okay. I noticed too that there were no ports on the machine except the power port and the card reader port. But a lot of, at least later calculators and of course computers had a lot of ports so that you could talk to the outside world, right? But they didn't really have that on these machines.
Yes, well, the ports were used for 2 things, I/O or plug-in extensions. TI had, with the 58, well, the 59, you could plug in little modules with additional programs on them, and HP introduced that later. But at this stage, you didn't plug things in, you just read information or programs off memory cards, and that was sufficient. When you bought one of these, you had something called a standard pack that came with an additional manual and a bunch of program cards with programs written for you on them. So that wasn't a plugin, that was ready-made programs that you could read on it. There was one other thing that you could call a port. You could pull this out. That was for a security cable. Because these things were fairly extensive, you could leave it on your desk, and when you came back, it wasn't there. So you could buy an HP cord made of steel, which went around, wrapped around here and locked up, and the other end you would lock to something in your desk.
I saw that on mine, and I assumed that's what it was, but thank you for answering that question.
Sure, that's what it was.
The display, you already talked a little bit about that. It's a red LED 7-segment display with 15 digits.
No, it was 10 digits. They were all 10 digits.
Oh, okay. I guess this information was incorrect that I pulled up then. In fact, I thought I counted 15 on my 97. It's not 15 digits?
All these machines, it may have 15 display elements because it also has an exponent and it has a sign. Plus a decimal point. So if you have 10 digits of information plus a sign, a decimal point, an exponent, 2 digits, and an exponent sign, that makes 15.
There you go. Okay. That answers the question.
Yes.
As far as storage, you've already talked a lot about the magnetic card reader, which is interesting. Those cards are not very long, and I know, tell me if I'm incorrect here, but I believe you can use the same cards that you use on an HP41.
Yes.
Well, do you know what the length is on this? Yeah, there they are.
Yeah.
So what it looks like maybe about 4 inches.
If I can find a ruler, I'll find one, but yes, 4 inches is about right. Yes.
Something like that. Yeah. And interesting too is that you can see on the cards, at least on the blank cards, I don't know if those have them or maybe they're already cut off, but you can cut the corners off in order to write protect them.
That's right. Yes. You could, if you cut the corner off, then you couldn't write on it anymore. Sorry. There we are.
And those already came that way, of course, right?
The ones you had purchased with the calculator came that way because obviously you had purchased the cards to use with programs you'd bought, and you would not want to destroy them.
You wouldn't, exactly. Yeah.
If you wanted to write your own programs or your own data, the card was white, not black, and it had dots to show you where you could cut the corner off. And then there was a whole industry of people making devices that would let you use a card that had the corner cut off. They made special little cards which you would push through the card reader ahead of this card to confuse it into thinking you could write onto a card which had the corner cut off.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That's interesting. Huh. So that would allow you to reuse maybe cards that had stuff on them that you didn't really want anymore.
That's right.
Huh.
I mean,
people find ways. They always find ways.
Yeah. Well, that's always been the case. I mean, SD cards have got a write protect switch these days, haven't they? It's the same idea.
All right, the OS, she talked about the fact that it's RPN, and that's what HP used on all their calculators until, well, until much later when you could actually.
The 1980s, they started making calculators that used algebraic notation as well.
Yeah, and that's my first calculator was a TI, So I knew the algebraic operating system on those. RPN is something I never really learned and got into, but I understand the um, advantages, I guess, of RPN and from a scientific standpoint.
Okay, let me put it this way. It's the way you learn to do arithmetic at school. You write one number down, you write the other number down, then you write plus, and then you add them up.
That's true.
If you're doing a subtraction, you write the first number down, then you write the second number down, and only when you've got both numbers ready can you do the subtraction. And that's the thinking behind reverse Polish notation. You have to have both numbers you're working with before you can do an operation on them. For that matter, if you're doing the square root of a number, you have to have the number before you do the square root. So all calculators that do calculations with numbers as opposed to symbols do actually use that method, even if you actually write down 7 plus 10 equals. What the calculator does is say 7, store that I'm going to do a plus with it, take the 10, and only when you press the equals key can actually do the addition. So internally, it's using the same method, but for your convenience, it's very nice when you're writing arithmetic down in a line as opposed to in a stack. Then you write 7 plus 10 equals, and therefore it lets you work that way.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm. But for someone doing a technological calculation, you will often want to see both the numbers you're using before you do an add or a multiply or something. So for complicated technical calculations, it was often more convenient to have this method. For the manufacturers, it was simpler because you did not have to store brackets and instructions. You carried them out at once. And as I said, HP were making their own chips, and they did not make many of them. They were expensive. So every bit of memory you could save was an advantage. And RPN does not have pending instructions, and therefore it uses less memory. So in a way, not only is it logical, but it's also a money saver.
Sure. Okay. I never thought of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Learned something there. Okay, as far as power requirements, the HP67 had 3 AA size nickel cadmium rechargeable batteries. And the 97 had a larger, or has a larger battery pack and a more powerful charger. I know the one I have for the 97 is pretty big. I don't even know what size you would say those batteries are, but it is pretty large.
I'm looking for my one. It's 4 C-size cells. It needed that much power to run the printer, because it wasn't just doing internal calculations, which is low power, and displaying, which at that time on the light emitting diode needed some power. This needed enough power to run the printer, and it was a thermal printer. The C cell, the smaller size cells, were enough for the card reader and card writer, because you could use those in an HP67, which read and wrote cards as well. So that was a low power device, but the printer was a heavy duty device, so you needed these cells.
Mm-hmm. Okay, as far as size and weight, the 67 I've got here is 6 inches by 3.2 inches and 11 ounces. So fairly light.
Yes.
HP97 considerably larger, 9 by 8. And I measured mine. I measured it to make sure I had all the dimensions right. 9 by 8 and it's tapered. So the height goes all the way from 1 3/8 to 2.5 inches.
Yes.
On the back. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's 2 pounds, 7 ounces. So it's pretty heavy. It's what, almost 3 times as heavy as the 67?
At least.
Yeah. Yeah.
They have never put 3 65s or 77s on one side of a scale and this on the other side, but maybe one day I'll try.
Well,
by
2
the way,
pounds,
you said
7
you thought the
ounces.
cards were 4 inches. As you've just said, the whole device is 9 inches wide. So that
Right.
does come to about 4 inches there.
Yeah. This seems about right. I'm usually pretty good about eyeballing that
Okay.
sort of thing. So now pulling it out of the box, now a lot of this information is going to be very similar to what we just talked about. You were showing the calculator there, but if you pull it out of a new box, and you can go to eBay and you can still find some that actually have their original box. So
Yes.
I'm guessing what, in some cases here, what was actually in the box, but it did include a leather case, very nice leather case with it. There was a power supply. There was the battery. There was a manual.
Yes.
I believe there was a quick reference card.
Yes.
And a standard pack was part of the package as well.
Manual, the standard. Yes, cards.
Yeah. And maybe programming pads. I don't know if that was part of the original package or if you
I
had to
don't
buy those
remember
separately.
programming pads in the box. You could buy them as accessories, but I don't think they
Okay.
came in the box. Actually,
Okay.
they were so big that they might not have fitted in the box. They looked exactly like pads that you use for taking notes at lectures, if you still take notes at lectures.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got a set of programming pads like that for my TI. I don't have those yet for the 97, but yeah, they're handy to have. And I don't have the leather case either, which is something I definitely would like to get for it.
Okay, yes. There was an interesting additional card, one at the bottom there.
The red one?
Yes. It was very slightly abrasive. And if you fed it through the card reader, it would try to remove magnetic dust that had come off the other cards.
Ah, okay.
Because if you read enough of these cards, very small amounts of magnetic dust would come off and settle on the roller, and eventually your card reader might find it difficult to read a card because it had so much magnetic dust on it. So this was an accessory. You pulled it through the card reader and it just cleaned it up.
Yeah, yeah. So you showed the machine. You can see that there were basically 3 different sets of keys in terms of different colors. So
yes,
there were basically a very light brown, which was the numbers. The medium brown were the plus, minus, enter, that sort of thing.
Print as well. The most
Print,
important,
right.
The most important user functions, yes.
497, yeah, exactly. And then the dark brown were the actual functions.
Indeed.
Over on the left there. And then you mentioned there were some other things you wanted to show on there as well.
Well, then there was a set of keys. There was obviously an on-off key. There was a key to decide whether you're working in radians, degrees, or gradians. And there was a key which said, am I programming this machine or am I running a program? So that was that set of 3. These were sliders, not keys.
So the switch that's labeled manual trace norm.
Yes. That's print. Oh, sorry. Yes. You set radians, degrees, or gradients with keys, and that was printer options. You could either say, I want to print things only when I press the print key. That's manual. You had a trace mode where when you were doing a calculation, it would print everything you were doing, so you could track what was going on. And then there was a norm mode where the calculator decided what you wanted to print, which was basically every number you entered and every result you got.
Yep. Okay.
And that came, well, that was carried over to the Hewlett Packard 41 printer.
I wonder if you would hold that up again and show everybody where that card reader slot is. You might have already done that, but I don't recall.
I haven't. It's actually very hard to see because cards were pushed into a slot here, which is
so it's in the
visible.
upper left. So for those that aren't watching the video, if you're just listening to audio, it's in the upper left of the
You can
machine.
just see there's a black darker gap there.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah, you
card
can-
went through and came out at the back in the small slot at the back, which is easy to see.
Mm-hmm. And the printer was in the upper right portion of the calculator.
Printer, yes. You had a roll of paper there, a thermal printer, and come out and you had a tear-off slot there. So if you were a shopkeeper and you did not have a modern printing till, you could add up everything that you'd sold to the customer and then tear off the printed copy and give it to them, or put it in your filing system. The printer was useful in stores where you could use print out a receipt, as well as for scientific results, engineering results, or for programs.
Yep. Okay. So using it was pretty simple. There's really nothing to hook up if you're running it off battery. You just turn it on, which is flipping the upper left switch that you pointed out.
Yes.
To on. It goes to the boot screen, which is just, if you're in run mode, just shows 0.00. It's ready for calculation entry. If it's in program mode, it comes up to the 00 space 00 display and ready for program entry.
Yeah, so it's step 0 and it's instruction 0 because you haven't entered one.
0. Yep. And then in program mode, you can just enter the keystrokes and it will automatically advance to your next, advance the program counter to your next memory location. And if you're in run mode, you can just enter your calculations in RPN.
Indeed.
For loading up software, you can switch it to run mode. You take a magnetic card with a program on it, slide the end. See, this is a little different coming from TI. There's an end labeled 1 on it. You run that one through first, and then if it requires it, you can turn it around to the end labeled 2, and then run that through as well. And then that will load in, both sides of the card.
Yep.
And it will say CRD then on the display.
Mm-hmm.
If everything worked. If not,
Yes.
you'll get an error message, which I've seen.
Yes. And of course, if it's as old as these are, then the rubber card reader roller will have completely oxidized. And instead of the card going through, it'll come up with an error message and the card will have gunk on the tip.
I see something in the upper right-hand corner of that. Is that
Yes.
what you're showing? Yeah.
And then you have to get someone or yourself to take it apart, which is fairly easy because this is technology from days when you were expected to be able to repair your own equipment, and you have to replace the roller. And then it'll work perfectly until the printer breaks, and then you'll have to fix the printer roller. I don't know that HP expected these to be still used and treated as either objects of reverence or of fun all these years later.
I'm sure they didn't expect them to be used, 50 years later, which is basically right, isn't it? 49 years.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
At least since these came out. All right, let's jump into the next section, which is user groups a little bit. So there were some user groups back in the day, as well as still ongoing user group activity, one of which was the PPC.
Yes.
Back in the day. So what can you tell us about the PPC?
Well, when the first programmable calculator came out, the Hewlett Packard 65, I don't know how many groups set up independently as user groups. You had a college and a whole bunch of people using these, and they wanted to exchange programs or exchange ideas. or even decide whether they were going to buy a TI or an HP or a Sharp or a Casio. So you had a user group. But one came out predominantly in California, set up by a guy called Richard Nelson, and he set it up calling it the HP-65 Users Club, and he published a journal about it, which I don't know if anyone else did originally. And the HP65 Club existed to swap tips and programs. And it kept running, and then the HP67 came out. And sometime around then, they changed their name from the HP65 user group to PPC. And nobody seems to know why they used the name PPC. It was the Personal Programmable Club for some people, and for other people, it was the Personal Programmable Calculator Group. And there are all sorts of explanations, but anyway, there it was. It was called PPC, and it started spawning user groups around the US and then around the world. Now, some of these were clubs which had already existed. For example, one in Philadelphia University, a guy called Jake Schwartz had set one up very early, and it became the Philadelphia branch of PPC worldwide. And there were very active groups in Chicago and Atlanta. There was one in Mexico quite early on. And we in the British Isles really learned about it when we started buying 41 calculators. So that was after the time of the 67, really. There were a very few British users of the 67 who were members of this worldwide club, but there wasn't a British user group. There was a German user group quite early on. I've mentioned the Mexican one. There was some in Canada. And we in Britain didn't actually set up as a group of PPC. They called themselves chapters. We didn't really use that name in England. We called ourselves PPC UK. But these were incredibly useful if you wanted to swap ideas, or if you wanted an excuse to leave your wife and go for a weekend with other hardened calculator users and go to a conference.
Yeah, you mentioned Richard Nelson. I've had him on the podcast before. He helped me talk about the HP41. So I know Richard, and I know he's done a lot, for the calculator aficionados out there.
A huge amount, yes. I don't know if this worldwide collection of users would have existed without him. It would probably have been local groups which just about knew about each other.
You mentioned a couple of unofficial names for PPC, what that stood for. Well, the one I came across said it was called Personal Programming Center.
That's right. That was one of the news. Yes.
There must have been several.
Yes.
Nobody knew what it really stood for.
What's interesting is that Richard Nelson, who was the founder, doesn't himself know of a single reason for using those letters. It probably came up. They had a clubhouse quite early on, and they'd get together in the clubhouse for calculator discussions, and every so often to pack the latest issue into envelopes and post them around the world. So this group of people grew very close, and the name probably came out of one of their discussions, and they themselves don't know how it came about, but it came out of one of their discussions, yes.
Okay, I also want to mention there are a couple of modern
Let me just mention, go on, yes.
Okay. Now, was there more you wanted to say about PPC?
No, you were just saying modern user groups. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say there are a couple of modern user groups, and I'll let you talk more about these, but I know one of them is the Handheld and Portable Computer Club, of which is in the UK. They're near you, so you want to tell us about that one?
Okay, well, I also mentioned that PPC had many local chapters, and in 1982, we set one up in the United Kingdom for 41 users, because that's when there was enough people to form a group. If there were 3 or 5 members of the United States Club around the whole British Isles, which is a fairly large island, they didn't get together. But when you came to have about 50 users of the HP41, it was worth setting up a club. An enthusiast who discovered PPC got a whole load of their back issues through his front door, sat down, and then said, right, we're going to found a club. And he wrote a letter to PPC, and a bunch of other people in the British Isles who were members of the American club said, all right, yes, Richard has his club in the United States, but David Birch wants to set one up here in Britain, and we did. We set it up probably about in May of 1982, and by October 1982, we had a large enough group that David Birch decided to have a conference in the United Kingdom. And we had a conference, close to 100 people turned up, not only from Britain. Richard Nelson came from the United States. People came from other countries in Europe, including Germany. Richard came to us, took part in our conference, and then he went off on a tour of Europe, visiting other clubs. So we were by no means the only club. In fact, we were probably the newest one. But the exciting or interesting thing is, we have kept going ever since. I don't know of any other club in the world that still regularly meets. We would hold a meeting in the senior common room in the physics department of Imperial College where I worked. And because we had the one place and the fixed date, the second Saturday of the month, every second Saturday of the month for 40 years, people just got to know that we were there. People just got used to coming there, and people just kept coming. Whereas other clubs, for various reasons, they were shut down. A few European clubs did advise their members to become members of our club. We continue going to this day. We now have online meetings on the first and third Saturday of the month, because we had online meetings during COVID, and people were so interested in that they've kept going. And we have people from all over the world. We've got regular attendees from Finland, Hungary, obviously Great Britain, from the United States, Canada. People turn up from Mexico. So those are worldwide meetings that we hold twice a month. And on the second Saturday of the month, we continue our London meeting. That gives us the fourth Saturday of the month to do something else, like go off for a trip to a museum or something. So this is a club that keeps going. We used to have regular contact with our members through a publication, but people aren't very interested anymore. So our printed magazine only comes out about once a year. And of course, we have a website like everyone. So we are incredibly lucky to keep going. Richard Nelson's group meets up for Christmas once a year in Los Angeles. A few other clubs occasionally meet, including one in Chicago. And the other thing is, there is a regular big conference for users of HP calculators in the United States every year. There are also conferences. We hold a small conference every year in Britain. There's a guy in Switzerland who holds one every year. And there are often one or two other conferences in Europe. So there you have it. You have a club which runs continually, other groups which meet occasionally, and conferences.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the HP Handheld Conference that's held in the U.S. Once a year.
Mm-hmm.
I want to get to one of those.
Do.
I know they often meet in Tennessee, in Nashville, I think, right?
They've often met in Nashville because one of our most active members, who is also a teacher, he is an expert on the business calculators that HP make. He advises a lot on them. And if no one else is willing to offer a meeting place or can arrange one, then by default, we meet in Nashville, which is
okay. Great. That's why it's so often in Nashville. That
yeah.
Explains it. Yeah. And I know
we have them on the West Coast more often than on the East Coast, but Nashville at the moment is the most common place to use.
Okay. Well, I do have links in the show notes to the website for the Handheld and Portable Computer Club that you mentioned, as well as the HP Handheld Conference. And they have a YouTube channel too, so all of the videos of the presentations that are given at the conference are posted there. In fact, I saw one that you did, I don't know, a couple of years ago maybe.
Yes.
And
Well, that site does show videos from our British conferences too.
Oh, okay.
At
Okay.
times.
Okay. And so yeah, so that's cool that there's so much still going on. That's very nice.
That's for people who want to meet physically, but of course, there's the whole world of the web as well, which I'm sure you'll come on to next.
There is. There's lots of options there. First of all, though, I want to talk about magazines and newsletters, and it looks like there were a lot of magazines and newsletters available in the day for the HP calculators in general, not just specifically for the 6797, but there were quite a few, available. I think you mentioned the HP Journal was an
The HP
HP
Journal was a
publication.
technical publication by HP in which they would generally showcase new technical products in general, not just calculators. They did have their own journal for a few years just for the calculators.
And is that the personal calculator digest? Is that what you're talking about, or?
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. Yes, yes. They then hived it off to some large publishing company, which produced about 4 issues and then decided it wasn't profitable.
Some of these sites that I went to, I found other newsletters or journals, so like the HP Exchange had a newsletter.
Yes. Okay. PPC continued publishing its own journal for calculator users until HP started making handheld computers. They then split up into something called the PPC Calculator Journal and the PPC Computer Journal. And then they had a big row. And basically, they threw Richard Nelson out, who was the founder and the guy who published the journal. So they more or less stopped publishing the journal. They had another guy who published the journal, a few more issues. And meantime, a guy in Atlanta decided that he would set up a new club for people who were disillusioned with PPC, and he called that the HP Exchange. And he published a journal. And also Richard Nelson, after he'd left PPC, set up his own club, CHHU, Computer Handheld Users, something like that, and published his journal. So those were direct descendants of the PPC journal. And both of those ran out of steam. There were big clubs in Germany, in France, in Holland, in Belgium. There was a club in Denmark, which produced a lovely journal. There was a journal produced in Finland, and there was our journal. When this breakup occurred at PPC, we stopped calling ourselves in Britain PPC UK and called ourselves the Handheld and Portable Computer Club, which of course stands for HPCC. In other words, the HP Calculator Club, really. But that wasn't the formal name we used. And we continued publishing, and we continue publishing to this day. And I think we're the only club journal that is still published, but even ours only comes out once a year now.
And yours is called Datafile.
Datafile, yes.
Yeah. And I've got links to that as well. And you can get all the back issues on a USB drive from Jake Schwartz, who you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
You can buy that from him, and I have done that. And it's a great way to get all of the, all those back issues.
And Jake has all back issues of the PPC journals and Chew and HHC and so on as well. So
right.
One of the most fascinating journals was published by an Australian group run by a math professor in Melbourne. And they were the first people to start publishing about getting into the internals of some of these calculators and programming them in their machine languages, which of course HP never envisioned anyone would do. So if you got some of these Australian journals, you wouldn't have the faintest idea what they were about, because they were talking about machine language, which you didn't even know was accessible. They were called the PPC Technical Notes, and they were published for years.
So there was a way that you could program the calculators in machine language rather than using the codes?
Yes.
Ah,
The initial trick was that some of the modules that you could plug into an HP41 had their instructions in machine code, not the code that you would type in as user code. And by analysis of those, people worked out what the machine code was, and then they would manufacture their own modules or things that you plugged in and that actually had your own quite extensive electronics. You would have a PC board plus a plug that went into the 41, and you developed everything on the PC board. Even before this, initially on TI calculators and later on HP calculators, people found ways of using the magnetic cards to create program steps that hadn't been intended by the manufacturers. So they were synthesizing new instructions that the CPU understood, but that hadn't been intended to be used. And this was called synthetic programming. First on TA calculators, then on the 65 and the 67, and later on the 41 to a great extent. So that's one of the topics that was covered very extensively in user journals, because of course HP didn't want people to know about it and certainly weren't going to support it. So it was only in user journals, not in HP journals, that you could read about that.
very interesting. You'd have to be pretty deep into it in order to want to use machine language on these calculators.
It's like kids who programmed early PCs or early computers in machine language and got the most out of them. And some of them would set up Microsoft, and others would go off and live in a corner for the rest of their days as being a games programmer.
And I used to do that. I used to program in machine language on my Atari 800 and my TRS-80 Model 1.
Mm-hmm.
So I know what that's like. But I didn't know you could do that on the calculators. I guess I always assumed that the key codes you were entering, that those were machine code.
No,
you know, that was machine code.
That was a macro language. Each of those would invoke a small program.
Yeah.
After all, if you press a sign key, the sign key doesn't mechanically calculate a sign. It goes off and tells something how to go into a loop until you get a result that's accurate enough to be a sign.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's it for this particular episode of Floppy Days. I want to give special thanks to Wlodek for his help in going through the tech specs and so on about the HP67 and 97. I really appreciate the time that he took to go through that stuff with us. I provided links in the show notes for all the great websites we discussed during this podcast. Go to floppydays.com for the full list. Please provide feedback if you get an opportunity or have the inclination. I always appreciate that. And there are many ways that you can do that. You can do it at Apple Podcasts. You can do it at the website. You can do it via email at floppydays@gmail.com. You can do it via Twitter at floppydays. On Mastodon at floppydays@oldbytes.space. On Facebook at facebook.com/groups/floppydays. Or on the Discord server, whose link is at floppydays.com. Besides the website and Apple Podcasts, Floppy Days is available for streaming at places like TuneIn, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Spotify. Until the next show, pull out a vintage computer and compute as if it were yesterday. Bye!